Welcome everybody to our handbook session. The section Worker Representation, Labor Management Relations and Labor Standards belongs to the Handbook of Labor, Human Resources and Population Economics, edited by Klaus Zimmermann. Our handbook section has 20 chapters and today we will present 6 chapters. I suggest we have 15 minutes for each presentation. So the first presentation will be by Francis Green, Decent Work and the Quality of Work and Employment. Francis.
Thank you so much, Uwe, for that introduction. And I'd like to begin. Can everybody hear me okay? First? Good, good. I'd like to begin by thanking you, Uwe, for inviting me to be part of this distinguished group and for giving me the challenge, but I think also the pleasure ultimately of going back over the literature that I've been involved with, coming in and out, as it were, for at least 20 years. So it was a pleasure to go back on it and return to some old haunting grounds and think about some issues from a sort of fundamental perspective. I'm going to start off by the technical bit of trying to share my screen. Where that looks, there we go. Share. Okay. So, okay. My topic is decent work and the quality of work and employment. How do I go? Yes, that's right. There we go. There we go. This is a topic which was really put on the agenda, I think, around about the millennium, when the director of the International Labour Organization announced for the first time a focus on what he called decent work. And he defined decent work as the most widespread need shared by people, families, and communities in every society and at all levels of development. A big claim to make, which was made in 1999. And soon after, there followed the European Commission. They called famously for the EU to become the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy, etc., etc. But up crops that phrase with more and better jobs. And again, a few years later, the OECD chips in with a call for more and better jobs. And you find some national governments also making that same mantra for more and better jobs. Now, of course, the issue of employment, the quantity of employment, I would say, is always uppermost in governments' minds. And subsequent global crises and conceptual confusions, I think, set back the job quality agenda somewhat. But nonetheless, it's still on the agenda. And now job quality is included, for example, in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It's Sustainable Development Goal 8. Decent work is one of its key objectives. And since that time, around the millennium, substantial progress has been made, both in developing the right concepts and consistent concepts, analyzing it, and in empirical terms. So the agenda's definitely moved on in the last 20 years. And the last time I wrote substantially about it in a book was 2006, the publication of my book, Demanding Work. I think things have moved on quite a lot since then. So it's potentially a good time for both old and particularly young researchers to be pushing forward the job quality agenda. Just a little bit on those two concepts of quality of work and employment. First of all, we have a kind of narrower concept of job quality, where if you think of all the characteristics of a job, some of them like how many in workplace, where's it located and so on, but some particular characteristics of a job are characterized as job quality: the wages, the prospects for it, the quality of the working time, and several intrinsic aspects of the job have been characterized as job quality because there is solid evidence and good theoretical reasons for them to be related to worker well-being. But and there are different groups and different writers have all sort of chosen their particular domains, but on the whole, there's fairly good agreement about what should be in there. Now, if you look at the ILO, it's a much broader concept, the concept of decent work. It's not just about the job itself, but it's about the labor market and the social environment. So it includes things like the quality of the social protection in a country or region, the labor market, and so on. And it also includes individual qualities, that is the qualities of the worker rather than the job. So that's a brief conceptual map, if you like. I have more conceptual complexities in the chapter explaining the different approaches that people have made. But essentially, the decent work concept is much broader than just job quality. And the fundamental idea of all of these is that job quality is defined by what contributes to meeting human needs from work. So it's very much a worker-centered concept. And what the paper sets out to do is to clarify some of these conceptual and measurement issues I've just referred to, set out some of the main theoretical frameworks, which I'm sure won't be new to anybody in this audience today, describe some of the stylized facts using data from the European Union, and in short, in sum, it proposes a new research agenda, which would be very much an interdisciplinary research agenda. So the four conceptual issues that I look at, or the ones I want to just mention today, is first, the link with well-being. Intrinsically, job quality is associated with well-being, intrinsically because of its definition, really. But it is not synonymous with well-being. And it's incorrect, I think, to sort of use well-being indicators as job quality indicators. Nevertheless, behind that link are several issues, several things that need thinking about. It's a tool for validation. If you have an index of job quality, such as flexibility, you like it much better if you can show empirically that it's definitely correlated with accepted indicators of well-being. Some writers have used that connection to try to determine the weights, so that if you're, for example, developing a single index of job quality, how do you compare the different aspects of a job, the intrinsic, for example, or the security aspects of the job, and you do it using some empirical data, and you use that empirical data to determine the weights. I'm very skeptical of that because it depends on the subjective well-being indicator you happen to use. And I think it's not very effective in, as it were, designing your best single index. And the other final thing is to mention is that, okay, there are pretty well established links with well-being, but nonetheless, behind that statement is an enormous research agenda, particularly which psychologists have engaged in for the last 15 years. But I still think it's a very pressing mission, and I'll come back to that later. Second issue is subjective evaluation and effect. And there are some writers, I need to press on with time, I realize, who still want to introduce a subjective element into it. And I argue quite strongly in the chapter against that as a way forward, while recognizing the importance of collecting well-being at work indicators, but not wanting to hybridize the concept so that it's kind of partly subjective, like job satisfaction, which we know depends on the individual, depends on their own alternative job prospects and so on. Basically, objective indicators are preferred because they are more properly compared across time, more properly compared between groups. and they're much more likely to be a focus for job policy, job quality policy. For example, it's hard to conceive of having regulation on job satisfaction rather than on wages. Continuing on conceptual issues, the third one, and I think this is worth dwelling on for a moment today, is the importance of process. There is one school of thought which says the process by which you negotiate or move to a particular set of working conditions doesn't really matter beyond the working conditions themselves. But another school of thought says is that participation, processes and procedures do matter, and that they themselves convey utility to the worker, convey well-being for the worker. So if you are the ILO, for example, you do put a lot of weight on participation through social dialogue. The European Union started off by saying they were going to do it and then decided not to. The OECD also decided not to include process participation in its own indicators of job quality. But recent evidence, both observational evidence and experimental evidence from a number of studies which I've cited in the chapter, and I thank Uwe for actually directing me in this direction, suggests that this may be wrong. And I do think that more is needed to look at that from an economist's point of view. And finally, it's pretty clear that if you take a human capability approach, and some writers are now starting to do that, it rather kind of mandates that you need to look at individuals' participation. Finally, final issue to mention, conceptual issue, is the link with productivity. I think most writers now agree that it is not a productivist concept we're dealing with here, but there are some who still want to include the quality of the work from the manager's perspective. But I think that's a wrong thing to do from an analytical perspective. Nonetheless, there are those two questions which I put there at the bottom. Is it the case that if you have a high productivity, or you have high per capita GDP, does that mean that workers have better quality, job quality? And also, putting it the other way around, there's a whole literature in economics and elsewhere suggesting that maybe if managers treat their workers better, then they'll get better performance out of them. There's some big issues there. Measurement issues, well, I'd say very quickly that they have come a long way since the late 1990s through the development of data. There are now very good handbooks from the United Nations, from the OECD. So statisticians the world over have some pretty good guidance, I think, on them. I would recommend those. And there's a lot of data being collected. Nevertheless, I do think that considering the relationship between job quality and well-being, and most studies show that if you like, look at the R-squareds, all the aspects of jobs relate quite highly with things like job satisfaction, that we devote rather little resources to looking at job quality in general surveys and so on. I talk quite a bit in the paper about lack of multidisciplinarity. Perhaps I'll pass on from that.
Oh, Francis, you have 5 minutes left.
5 minutes. Thank you very much. Yeah, I knew I was under pressure. There's no place here to set out a particular theory of job quality, but what I describe is the general frameworks, and you have kind of mainstream economics framework, which says it's essentially part of the theory of economic growth and what determines the wage share over the long time. But then, of course, it's qualified by the theory of compensating differentials. But if you're a heterodox economist or sociologist, you tend to stress institutional variation, national variation, and the role of regulation. And all writers are often grappling with this question: is there a convergence of job quality between groups, or is there bifurcation or polarization, and so on and so forth? And I cover some of those issues in the chapter. And then there's the whole question of the literature on the effects on well-being. There are a few studies of the links between decent work and well-being. The general link is very, very well established, but I do think that the thriving literature, which, as I say, is dominated by occupational psychologists more than economists, I'd say. There are several things that need clarifying and quantifying better for policy and intervention purposes. And there is, as I suppose I might say this as an economist, there's a need to improve the rigor to look more closely at the causal nature of some of the findings that get reported. So I'm going to finish in my last few minutes on looking at a few stylized facts, which are taken from the European Working Conditions Survey. And they are as follows. First of all, if you look at the trends over time, and it's a limited extent to which we can do this, we do find a general increase in physical working conditions indices across the European Union and in working time quality. But, and I suppose this is the biggest finding, nothing is rapidly changing. I always, as an older skeptic on these matters, always skeptical of saying things are rapidly changing, but particularly with jobs, actually things are usually changing very slowly. But what is remarkable is that there are very large differences between countries, usually of an order of a standard deviation or so. They're not minor differences between countries. I looked at the gender gaps also across the very different domains, and usually pretty well in every country. It won't surprise you to know that there's a pro-male gender gap for earnings, but there are actually pro-female gaps for the indices of physical working conditions and some other domains. And the final thing I'll show you is an investigation, a very crude investigation into the relationship between these indicators of well-being, indicators of job quality domains and GDP per capita. And I'm going to show you just two. Here's one, and here's something you might expect, that the monthly earnings indicator is of course higher in countries with higher GDP per capita, which is on the x-axis here. But actually, if you take all the other domains, you get a picture something like this. And this is for the physical environment. Basically, there are a few countries down here which have very low physical environment quality indicators, and they're at the low end of the GDP per capita across Europe. But the rest of it is, I'm sure you can see, pretty much a mishmash. And that's true for other indicators as well. Here's the working time quality indicator. So if you like, what this shows is that it's not sufficient just to take GDP per capita or some simple monetary indicator of how job quality varies between groups, in this case between countries. I finished with a slide on the agenda for research into quality of work and employment. I'm sure that Uwe is going to stop me any moment now. I'll just go therefore to the final bullet point there, which I do try to stress more than once in the paper, which is this is particularly par excellence an area where we need to be approaching it from a multidisciplinary perspective. And although I've sometimes berated economists in the past for being kind of insular and just looking within their own fields, it's quite shocking to find other disciplines doing exactly the same. I found a group of psychologists, for example, who started developing a concept of decent work just because they liked the phrase, which with virtually very few references to the literature on jobs and quality and decent work that had been going on for 20 or 30 years. I found that quite shocking, actually. So in order to make progress as decent social scientists, we need to be multidisciplinary. So thanks for listening.
Francis, thank you so much for your great presentation. And I think we have a couple of minutes for questions and answers. Are there any questions or comments?
Yes, there would be one, if I may. I'm talking about unionization in a minute, but I do not talk about the relationship between unionization and decent work. Is there any strong correlation?
The ILO would regard a unionization that's intrinsic to decent work. Yeah, so it's as much a conceptual question, I think, as anything else. Obviously, as you know, participation in workplace decisions can take place at a representative level, such as through unions, or at different levels and through different channels. I am very much behind the idea that participation should be included as an aspect of decent work. I think also as an aspect of the narrower job quality, I think part of job quality should be the ability to participate in making decisions, at least within limits, about the sort of work you do. I think there's slightly an empirical question about whether participation at a higher level is something that everybody wants. It may be that the average worker would be content with a decent working environment, doesn't want to actually be involved in decision making. I actually think this is an area which requires further empirical work and probably will be settled by further empirical work rather than somebody kind of philosophizing about that it must be from some kind of broader democratic principle included in the job quality. So certainly if you were Amartya Sen, you would say yes, I think, or if you were using a capability approach.
Okay. I can see Jens.
Thank you. Francis, you said during your talk that you a bit disregard the literature on well-being and productivity. Could you please elaborate a bit on your arguments why you think this is not the right direction?
Well, on the well-being argument, I believe it's very hard to, well, an individual's well-being depends not just on the job quality, but on comparators. So, for example, job quality, job satisfaction could be quite low if you think you should have a much better job. But on the other hand, if you think you have even though you've got bad working conditions, the alternative for you was much worse conditions, then you might express quite high job satisfaction. So I'm not against the job satisfaction measure per se, but we have to understand what it tells us. So that's that. With productivity, the productivist approach, what I'm saying is that management have a concept of work quality, which is, are people working efficiently, essentially? We'd understand it as economists are saying, are people working efficiently? Is the organization efficient? Is work efficient? And that's fine. I'm not arguing against that concept, but it shouldn't be conflated with whether the quality of the job is meeting the individual worker's needs. And I think there will be circumstances in which the management's needs and the workers' needs are the same. They overlap, but we shouldn't kid ourselves that they always overlap. They're in conflict. And I believe that there is a school of thought which says, okay, well, if only we could just persuade managers to do this, everybody would be better off. And I think that's intellectually weak thinking, personally. I think that the evidence isn't there. And I think the task of us now is to think better about the circumstances in which mutual gains are possible and the other circumstances when you know, when there's essentially a conflict. There's a wonderful study, historical study of miners about 50 years ago in a part of England, where the writer shows that certain health and safety measures, which would have saved miners' lives, were not introduced. And the writers did the appropriate cost-benefit calculations and found that in terms of the standard value of human life, and the compensation they would have had to pay, that was less than the cost of having to do these health and safety things. So it didn't happen. So the miners' lives were lost. But it wasn't in the interest, obviously, of the miners. So we have to think about it from a realistic perspective. So I think, does that help saying the way I think about it?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yes, many thanks for the questions and the answers, and again, many thanks for the great presentation. We now move on. Klaus Schnabel will present his chapter on union membership and collective bargaining, trends and determinants.
Well, thanks for the introduction. Can you see my screen? Because I'm not sure here the way it looks here. Well, as you just mentioned, the chapter is on the union membership and collective bargaining, and the contents are quite straightforward. After an introduction, the first part deals with union membership and density, and the second main part is on various aspects of collective bargaining, and then I conclude with a summary. So let me start by stressing, and I think most of you would agree, that workers' voice via unions and via collective bargaining, that these are both important labor rights and also key labor market institutions. For instance, if you only look into the OECD, in the OECD countries, we have about 80 million union members and about 160 million workers who are covered by collective agreements. And I think it's obvious that unions and bargaining play a major role, in particular in determining pay and working conditions, decent work, as Francis just mentioned. And of course, they also affect employment, productivity, inequality, and so on. And looking in the future, we can also expect that unions and bargaining may further shape our changing world of work, even in times of globalization, digitalization, and growing inequality. And this gives rise to two main questions, which I deal with in this chapter. First, which factors determine the extent of unionization and collective bargaining coverage? And second, how have these two indicators developed over time? Let me start with unionization, and the main indicator we look here, we use here is union density. So that means union membership as a proportion of wage and salary owners in employment. Well, density has fallen over the last decades in most advanced countries. For instance, within the OECD, I observed 25 countries, and you have a decline in union density in 23 out of these 25 countries. It's not the same in every country. In some countries, union decline is a little bit faster than in others, but we see it almost everywhere. And interestingly, density also varies substantially across countries. We have some countries, such as Iceland, where it's 90%, and we have other countries, such as Estonia, where it's only 4%. And there is no clear sign of an international convergence in density over time. So we can state that unions are on the retreat, but I would like to point out that they are not about to become extinct everywhere, as is sometimes argued, particularly in Anglo-Saxon countries. You can also see this here when you look at this graph, which I've taken from a publication by Visser. Here we have 4 large world regions: Africa, Asia, Europe, and America. And you can see that northern, I'm not sure whether you can see my cursor, but that Northern Europe stands out at the top end, and the Arab countries here, they stand out at the lower end of unionization. In general, you can say that union density is lowest in the poorest countries, but the Arab countries are an exception to this rule. And you can also see that in most countries, we see the downward trend in most, but not in all regions. And of course, it's obvious that there is substantial variation internationally. So what is behind these different figures of union density? What are the determinants of unionization? Well, there is plenty of empirical evidence on this. For instance, a stylized fact is that the business cycle does play a role. Union growth is typically found to be pro-cyclical. Also, structural factors may be of importance. For instance, sectoral differences, that union density is usually much higher in the public than in the private sector. And the employment shift, which we observe from manufacturing to private services, also should have some explanatory power. Another important facet is the changing composition of the workforce, so that we have increasing shares of women, of people in non-standard employment, of foreign-born workers, and so on and so on. This does play a role, but the empirical evidence shows that it plays a much smaller role than is widely believed. Another important factor are institutional settings, such as the Gantt system of union-administered unemployment insurance. And what is important is also union access to or presence at the workplace. These all can push up union density. Interestingly, the role of the structure of collective bargaining is rather inconclusive. Something which is often discussed is globalization. And I would say that globalization and the informal economy clearly pose a threat to unionization. But again, the empirical evidence is not very conclusive here. Last but not least, country-specific conditions, national traditions, and of course also historical influences may be relevant for unionization. Now let me move on to collective bargaining. Here we mainly look at two indicators. The first one is the bargaining coverage rate. That is the number of employees covered by collective bargaining as a share of wage and salary owners in employment. And again, here the coverage rate has fallen over the last decades in most advanced countries. And the coverage rate also varies substantially across countries. In some European countries, it's above 90%, whereas in the large and important countries such as Japan or the United States, it's below 17%. And there's no sign of convergence, rather there's a sign of international divergence over time. Another indicator which is worth looking at is the predominant level at which wage bargaining takes place. This also varies substantially between countries and over time. Bargaining mostly takes place at a firm or enterprise level, but we also see some decentralization tendencies in various countries. But we should not only look at this predominant level of bargaining, bargaining coordination of wage policies is also quite important. Here I have some figures to demonstrate this for only selected countries. Here's the predominant level of bargaining, ranging from 1, that is company or enterprise level bargaining, to 5, which is central bargaining. And you see that between 1980 and 2018, there has been some decentralization in several countries, most notably in Spain and particularly in the United Kingdom. And in the last column, I present the change in coverage rates in percentage points from 1980 to 2018. And there have been some countries where the coverage rate even has increased, for instance, in Austria. But there have been many countries where we have a substantial decrease in the bargaining coverage, for instance, in in Germany or most notably in the United Kingdom. So what is behind this? What are the determinants of bargaining structure and coverage? The literature points out that the bargaining coverage is usually high and stable in countries that make use of multi-employer bargaining. That means that they conclude agreements at national or sectoral level. There's the obvious question a bit of the relationship between bargaining and union density. And obviously bargaining coverage is linked to union density, but the relationship is far from perfect. When I calculated the Pearson correlation coefficient for OECD countries, it's only 0.54. So this implies that the fall in coverage, which we observe, is not simply a corollary of declining union density. The empirical evidence also shows that in most countries, bargaining coverage is much higher than union density. And looking at potential determinants, we see that sectoral and workforce composition plays a role, but again, a smaller role than usually believed. Firm size makes also a difference because bargaining coverage is typically lower in small firms. And we should not overlook that country-specific regulations and government intervention play a major role concerning bargaining structure and bargaining coverage. Looking at the tendency of decentralization, one obvious economic explanation would be that there have been changes in the relative advantages and disadvantages of various levels of regulation that may have brought about both a decentralization of collective bargaining and also a fall in bargaining coverage. Coming back again to globalization, interestingly here, the role which globalization plays has not been fully clarified in the literature. There's still some research to be done. So first, some conclusions.
5 minutes left, but you already have the conclusions.
Okay, yeah, I have one more slide. In the conclusion, I still want to stress again that although unionization and bargaining coverage have fallen in most regions and collective bargaining has become more decentralized, that's not necessarily the end of the world. So I'll come back to this in a minute. And there is a substantial variation across countries and also between different indicators of unionization and bargaining. What I also found interesting is that some seemingly obvious explanations do not seem to hold on closer scrutiny. For instance, union growth and decline are not mainly due to changes in the sectoral structure of the economy and the composition of the workforce. And also, although we think we know what the effect of globalization is, I think the effect of globalization on unionization and collective bargaining has not been fully clarified. And also the relationship between unionization and decentralization is open both theoretically and empirically. What is clear, or what we find typically, is that bargaining coverage depends more on the level at which bargaining takes place than on union density. And it's typically high and stable in countries with multi-employer bargaining. I already mentioned this. The question is, what does this mean for the future? So a brief outlook. I think, although I've mentioned many problems, unions are still key players in the labor market in many countries. And also collective bargaining systems are quite important labor market institutions and continue to be this. In my opinion, a major challenge for both unions and collective bargaining is to stay relevant. Stay relevant in a world of work that is changing quickly. For unions, this means that they must react to the rise of the informal sector in many regions and also to new types of work. So they must try to be more successful in recruiting young and atypically employed workers. In addition, bargaining structures must be flexible and collective agreements must be differentiated to better correspond to the needs of firms I think here some progress has been made in recent years. It's an open question whether and how governments should engage in stabilizing unions and employers associations, and also in stabilizing the national systems of collective bargaining. One idea is, or some people argue, that institutions whose time is over should not be kept alive artificially. Even the eminent sociologist Wolfgang Streeck once argued like this. On the other hand, you can argue that unions and bargaining are crucial instruments for preventing inequalities in a changing world of work. So let me conclude with a very personal statement. I think that unions and collective bargaining were written off many times in the past, but they have been quite resilient and they have managed to reshape themselves several times. Of course, it remains to be seen whether they can repeat this trick in a world with mega trends like globalization, migration, and digitalization. Thanks a lot for listening.
Yes, many thanks for this very interesting presentation. I'm sure there will be some questions on this important topic. Yes, Francis.
Thank you, Klaus. Really, really great to have that overview. One question which probably you may not have covered though in the chapter is the effect of the unions in the UK, which I was alarmed to see had by far the largest collapse of union density. I knew it was large. I've also seen studies and partially involved in some which showed that the union effect on wages and other things is somewhat less, at least significantly less than it used to be. Even for those people who are remaining in unions, the effect is reduced and interpreted as a sort of grand shift of bargaining power away from workers. Is that a general trend, do you think, that even for those people who are covered, has the effect declined?
I have not covered it in detail, in particular because another chapter deals with the effects of unions. But I would agree that the wage effect, but also the possibility to push through decent working conditions, this has declined in many countries. So unions are less powerful than in the past. And in some countries, including Germany, this has resulted in unions calling for the government to introduce minimum wages or living wages. So that's a very interesting discussion going on this. And the question, of course, is whether governments really should intervene or not if unions are too weak. Interestingly, the OECD in recent publications has stressed the need for strong unions or for a functioning bargaining system, because in OECD view, that's the only way how you can cope with the challenges ahead.
Okay, are there further questions? Laszlo?
Perhaps that's going a bit beyond what you've done, but usually union density is measured sort of like as the number of union members divided by employed individuals, something like in that direction. Yeah. In some countries, it seems to be that unemployed union members are non-existent. Others, they are fairly frequent. Do you have any data on that, Klaus? Like how large sort of the share of unemployed union members is, because that would convey information about, say, union power or differences in union power. Do you have anything on that? Do you know anything about that?
I don't have good figures on this. ELFISO has, but only for very few countries. So in recent publications by ELE, and also I think in the former ICT WSS database, which is now run by the OECD, you have some data. You have various definitions of union density, and some of them try to include the informal sector or unemployed people and so on. But we do not really have very good evidence on this in most countries. Very good data.
Okay, a final question by John.
Thanks for the presentation. In North America, I think, one of the key debates in terms of decline in unionization is the role of managerial resistance, union busting. Not just sort of, broader trends like digitalization or globalization, but really active managerial strategies in the workplace to, dissuade workers from the need to join unions, et cetera. Is that something you address in your chapter? Is that more of a North American thing, or what role does sort of active managerial opposition play?
I must admit that I only mentioned it, I think, in one sentence, and with a specific reference to the United States. This does not mean that it doesn't play a role in other countries, but for instance, in Germany, it would not be union busting in the sense of managers opposing the unionization of a firm. It's a opposition to establishing a works council, which is the equivalent in Germany of a plant-based union. So there are examples for this as well, but it depends a lot on which system you are and whether, say, labor relations are more cooperative or more characterized by the confrontation issues which we find in the United States.
Yes, okay, many thanks for the questions and answers. We have now the third presentation on unions, worker participation and worker well-being by John Haywood. Yes, John, please.
Thanks, Eva, for the introduction, and thanks to both Francis and Klaus for their papers. Let me try to share my screen here. Can you see the screen, everyone? Okay, well, this is joint with Ben Arts, who's just up the road here in Wisconsin. And the subject is unions, worker participation, and worker well-being. I went into this hoping to decide that there were some strong general tendencies and came out feeling that the literature was pretty much contested in every part. So I'll try to give a sense of that. Let me also encourage you to look at Laszlo's article in chapter in the book. He's on the seminar today. His overlaps in a meaningful way, and I encourage you to take a look at that. So the broad research question is simply, what is the relationship between worker representation and worker well-being? I think there's a lot of heterogeneity in the answer, as I suggested. Let me try to come at it in a number of ways and try to move through this fairly quickly. One issue is looking at union membership as representation and thinking about job satisfaction as at least one part of worker well-being. Another part is there are many alternatives to membership that can be considered representation, some of them management-driven, some of them alternative institutions in other countries, and we'll try to give a sense of how those might matter. And I'll talk a little bit about measures of well-being beyond job satisfaction to see what can be found. So the start of this, as I'm sure most are aware, was in the 1970s in US data. There seemed to be a paradox between the superior working conditions of union members and lower reported job satisfaction. In fact, interestingly enough, I think this is really the way in which subjective measures of job satisfaction came into mainstream economics, even though they'd been used in other disciplines for a long time. The paradox was questioned, was where does it come from? And the most fundamental argument was that from Richard Freeman, and indeed with Medoff, they spend a full chapter in their classic book, What Do Unions Do?, arguing that this should be anticipated because it's an example of a voice mechanism in which the members need to motivate and rally to improve working conditions, and they actually need the dissatisfaction as part of the process. This led to a discussion about whether it was genuine or instrumental, but certainly Freeman and Medoff thought it was genuine. So how general has this been over the years? There's a relatively recent meta-study across 6 studies that suggests a general tendency for unions to be associated, union membership to be associated with lower job satisfaction. I emphasize that this isn't a statement about causation, and much of the literature examines endogeneity and the exact nature of causation. There does appear to be heterogeneity by country, by broad occupation, by gender, and perhaps even by time period, as I'll try to suggest. So one form of what might be going on is sorting by workers. Unions might attract dissatisfied workers to a forum for complaining. John talked about the situation in the US. There are active consulting firms in the US who give personality tests, the purpose of which is to try to identify potential workers who would support a union and be active in it, and encouraging employers not to hire them. So at least from the point of view of the employers, the idea that some of the union characteristics of complaining are inherent seems sensible. Typical ways that economists and others deal with that is to do fixed effect estimates in which we examine changes within workers, and these often, but not always, confirm the negative relationship. But sometimes the results are quite nuanced. Ben Artz, my co-author, shows that first-time members are more satisfied, but all returning members are actually less satisfied. If they've had experience as a union member, have left that, and then return to it, they express less satisfaction. And Bryson and White in the UK emphasized the important interaction between membership and coverage. Coverage matters differently for members and non-members. The second possibility is that unions sort into unpleasant jobs, that inherently unpleasant jobs tend to be more unionized. And researchers have responded with a variety of instrumental variable approaches and find in some cases that union members would be dissatisfied with their current jobs even if they were not members. They're simply not good jobs and they become unionized. And these have to do with the working conditions. And one particular example of this was Bender and Sloan arguing that really what's behind this is poor employer-employee relations and poor communication. And once you control for that, unions may play no role at all. So let's talk a little bit about detailed longitudinal patterns. Artz has a couple of articles, Ben does, in which he suggests that workers joining a unionized job for the first time report an initial increase in job satisfaction, but that over time, with continued exposure to unionization, satisfaction declines. He calls this an example of an experience good, and the decline reflects that. On the other hand, using UK data, there's evidence of an Ashenfelter dip. That is, that the original rise in satisfaction that Ben also found in the US data is really just a response to unusually low satisfaction in a previous non-union. There have been some natural experiments that are interesting to look at as well. Recent article looks at how commonly experienced policy change in pensions in the UK affects union and non-union workers within the public sector. And the difference in difference suggests there's really no difference at all. So at least on this specific characteristic, union and non-union members view the change identically. But critically, there may be changes afoot. Blanchflower, Bryson, and Green, and Artz, Blanchflower, and Bryson present evidence of changing patterns in both the US and the UK. They argue in very recent papers that a negative association between job satisfaction and membership actually becomes positive more recently. They date those to slightly earlier in the UK and slightly later in the US. If confirmed, it raises some very interesting questions about whether it's union members that have changed their perceptions, or whether union jobs have changed, or whether the composition of union jobs has changed. And I'm sure there will be more to come. But there are really enormous differences by country, and many people emphasize that the differences are really between Anglophone, Anglo-Saxon countries, US, UK, Canada, Australia, and other countries. And while the Anglophone countries are not monolithic, they do generate the vast majority of the negative correlations between membership and job satisfaction. These countries share, obviously, legal and cultural backgrounds, but perhaps more importantly, they have the wage bargaining at the level of the firm, and so the resulting conflict and lack of trust happens closer to home in these countries. So Vandermeer shows that union membership plays no role among workers in continental Western European countries in his examination. He claims what matters are measures of employment and that these positively influence job satisfaction. Others have shown that you can find a positive, negative, or no correlation depending on the country, and also argue that it's the country institutions that are more important than membership per se. So the question is, which institutions matter? Works councils, which we'll hear more about from Jens later in today's presentation, are representative bodies that increase the ability of workers to influence working conditions. And Uwe and co-author have shown that blue-collar workers in workplaces with works councils report greater job satisfaction, although this doesn't carry over to part-time workers or managers, which might be expected. Others have shown that workers moving from a workplace without a works council to one with a works council experience a job satisfaction. And finally, using establishment level data, there's German evidence showing that works councils are associated with increased average job satisfaction. And Bellman and his co-authors suggest that this has to do, at least in part, with improved training opportunities. One of my old-time favorites is Kleiner and Lee, who examined South Korea, which presents an interesting mix of sort of institutions where unions and works councils are more nearly at the same level. They have firm level bargaining, but have works councils. And in this interesting case, unions are associated with decreased job satisfaction, but a works council, and especially one that the workers think is effective, is associated with increased job satisfaction. And Kleiner and Lee suggest that the idea of voice and its influence on job satisfaction depends on the purpose of the voice, that to improve compensation is fraught with distrust, and to improve local working conditions is less fraught with distrust. And this idea of improving local working conditions and perhaps even having win-win situations goes back to the idea of worker voice.
John, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. So establishments with works councils may do a better job representing the desires of workers on specific issues. We look at some of them. We particularly looked at family-friendly practices, which in Germany seems to be associated with works councils, and even the share of women when the works councils are present, although this may be true only under industry level bargaining. And there's some experimental evidence, again, that when the provisions of works councils were spread more generally through the EU in the early 2000s, that there was more flexible working arrangements in the newly covered countries. And this can be contrasted with the role of unions in the US and UK, which both I and John Budd have done some work on, which seems to be very heterogeneous. There's no clear rule. So other forms of voice, which I'll mention very quickly, is some joint consultative committees in the UK provide workplace representation. It's pretty weak. But surprisingly, there's at least cross-sectional evidence that it's associated with increased job satisfaction. This may be sort of weak works councils. Similarly, there are worker safety committees in both the US and UK that may be reported, that seem to be associated with fewer reported injuries. And this may mimic the works council again, which Uwe and co-authors have shown are associated with promoting workplace health. Finally, other forms of voice include high involvement management, where practices may create greater worker voice, but also demands on workers. I think the evidence is very mixed on whether these management techniques increase worker satisfaction. We've easily found examples that said strongly yes and some that said strongly no. Our own work, my work with Keith Bender and others, shows that if you look at just the participation in voice elements in the US, there may be increased worker satisfaction. Interestingly, even more strongly, there were reduced claims of gender and racial discrimination, suggesting participation may enhance the perception of workplace fairness. Talk very briefly about life satisfaction. It seems to me here it's unclear as well. There's some suggestion that trust is and even trust with employer is critical for life satisfaction, and that union members have much less trust in management, and specifically when the management wants to fight the union or wants to disband them, and then this means that union members have lower life satisfaction. On the other hand, there's some suggestion from the World Values Survey that US union members may have higher job satisfaction, and they suggest this may be because the unions provide all kinds of opportunities for building social capital and human interactions away from the job. I think the evidence from other countries suggests, some of the evidence anyway, suggests that this may not be anything but a selection effect, that unions attract these people. At least there's evidence from the UK and Switzerland suggesting that. I know John and Ryan will have much more to say about that in the next talk. So let me try to conclude. So this has been an area of contested theories and evidence for nearly 50 years. I think strong takeaways are probably unwarranted. It's not the case that representation of any type seems to improve well-being, which I think chimes in with something Francis said. On the other hand, it's probably wrong to say that there's a general paradox and the result is that representation is negative. That's equally wrong. There are differences by institutions, countries, and time periods. The negative associations do tend to come from the Anglophone countries, but even this may be changing of late. Other forms of representation also appear contested or at least nuanced. And despite all of this, I'll leave with one last point, which is I do think there's reasonable evidence that workers say that they value representation and participation. I mean, there's a lot of work on the representation gap in the US and the UK, which is, those workers who don't have these mechanisms overwhelmingly say they want some way to influence their workplace. So that's it for me, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for this great presentation, John. I'm sure there will be some questions. Jens?
Yeah, I have a question about the differences between types of workers. If I believe that maybe workers or employees compared each other, and if I have some, for example, companies where we have a lot of precarious work in terms of fixed term contracts, temporary workers, 0-hour contract workers or something like that, is there then some evidence that then the core employees feel better in terms of their satisfaction if they work with a lot of precarious workers together, or is it exactly the opposite, that I feel for them and thinking it's a bad job at all?
Yeah, that's a tricky question that may or may not have much to do with representation. There's a lot of evidence of, and you're probably aware, Jens, of sort of comparisons influencing job satisfaction. I mean, my first take on that is, you feel better when you're doing better relative to the people you're comparing yourself with. Certainly when you look at wages and certain kinds of working conditions, there's a fair amount of evidence on that. So I think that's at least empirically more nearly the case than, sort of feeling bad because some people that I'm comparing myself to are doing poorly.
Okay, further questions? John?
So going back to at least maybe North American or Anglo unions having negative or positive effects on job satisfaction, right? And you talked about sort of the shift from negative to maybe more recent research finding a positive association. I have sort of this vague sense that sort of before that, maybe some of the research of Bryson and others was finding that more calling into question even the earlier negative effects with richer information on job quality, danger of jobs. So am I making that up, or is there something going on there?
I don't think you're making it up, John. I'm not at all convinced that it was superior data or superior techniques, but that's not to minimize the contribution. I think it's fair to say there were ambiguous results, even using roughly similar data and techniques. I think Alex's big contribution in the UK, and I mentioned this briefly, but say more in the article, was to emphasize the difference between membership and coverage, which is much more important in the UK than it is in the US. And his point was that coverage meant an awful lot and increased the well-being of non-members. So he was telling us sort of a, if you will, almost a free rider story. I hope I made it clear that I didn't want to suggest that the evidence was monolithic up to the recent time, that union membership always had a sort of, or union coverage always had a negative effect in the Anglophone countries. I don't think that was true.
Okay, many thanks for the questions and answers. We now move on to John Butt and worker voice and political participation in civil society.
Go. So first, thanks to Uwe for including us in the handbook and for his guidance as we wrote our chapter, and thanks for inviting us here. And the dog's been quiet the entire time and now decides that it's time to bark. I apologize for that. Hopefully my daughter will corral him. So our topic is worker voice and political participation in civil society. And I will, this is co-authored with Ryan Lamar, who's also here this morning. And so I'll do the first part and then I'll hand over to Ryan more in the middle. So our motivation here is, unlike Las Vegas, what happens in the workplace doesn't necessarily stay in the workplace. Right? There's a long distinguished body of work. Some of it more conceptual or hypothetical, some of it more empirical, right? Trying to, make this point, right? Some very distinguished scholars, influential thought leaders, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, John Stuart Mill, right? In various ways, all talked about possible connections, spillovers from the workplace beyond. And so, the more recent literature sort of takes this up in a more focused way, and looking at, is there a relationship between what happens in the workplace in terms of voice, and that could be non-union voice, individual voice, could be union voice, and what happens in the political civic arenas. Are union members more likely to vote is maybe one of the most concrete questions, but as you'll see, we take a broader approach here. And the typical mindset, if you take my arrow on the screen here literally, right, is more of a causal relationship. Voice causes people to vote more frequently or to donate to charity or whatever your measure of political and civic participation is. And we will try to keep that in mind. We definitely keep that in mind throughout our chapter. We'll try to keep that in mind, as you'll see as we go through our presentation here as well. And the punchline is, as in a lot of other literatures, right, there's sort of, mixed success in terms of how much we can really account for causality versus other sort of non-causal explanations. But the literature is definitely aware of that, which is a good thing. So, there's a broad literature here. It's very multidisciplinary. There's economists, sociologists, political scientists, industrial relations scholars, some psychologists who are engaged in different parts of this literature. Unlike maybe the segmentation that Francis talked about in terms of job quality, there does seem to be more integration here, which is good. And we try to take a broad approach in our chapter, right? So some of it is more non-union based. Think about individuals experiencing just more autonomy or self-determination in the workplace, or those experiencing more collective forms of voice in their workplace. And there's lots of theorizing and empirical work connecting that to things like, are these individuals more likely to vote than people who haven't experienced these degrees of non-union or collective voice? Did they engage in other types of civic or charitable activities? So one aspect of our broad approach is both non-union as well as collective or union voice. And I'll sort of refer to collective voice as labor unions as a shorthand. It's not the only way. Other presentations have mentioned works councils. There might be some kind of similar effect there, or worker centers. Labor unions doesn't have to be the only form of collective voice, but it's perhaps the clearest, and I'll just use that as a shorthand. But there can also be more aggregate effects of labor unions beyond just sort of these individual effects. And so that's part of our broad approach as well. And so that's how we structure our chapter, more sort of conceptual methodological discussion, then appraising the individual level evidence, as well as appraising the aggregate level evidence, and sort of, how we'll structure the rest of our presentation here, but obviously we don't have time to go into all of these aspects. So we'll try to pick out some highlights. So just quickly, if we think about, why might there be a relationship between the workplace and broader society, right? One place that people have started is if you think about individuals who have more autonomy in their workplace, they're able to make more decisions, have input into decisions, right? The idea is that can develop attitudes of confidence, feelings of agency, give workers more desire for controlling things, having input into things. And it also might develop skills, negotiation skills, communication skills, problem-solving skills. And these types of attitudes and skills might also come through participation in union activities, other forms of workplace voice. Okay, so what does that have to do with political arena or civic arena? Well, the basic argument here is that these attitudes can also then spill over into the political arena, feelings of agency in the workplace, want me to have more input or give me more confidence in participating in the political arena or the civic arena. Advocacy skills, communication skills, those skills can translate into the political arena as well. And so that's the basic sort of spillover model with these two main categories of mechanisms or channels. One is the creation of certain types of attitudes, other is creation of skills. Now, a couple quick notes here, right? This might be context dependent, and for the most part, these channels are sort of unintentional. Managers aren't giving workers more voice because they expect this to create political skills or political attitudes, right? It's just sort of a happy byproduct. If it happens, it's a happy byproduct. But unions can also be intentional. Right, there's get out the vote drives and drives to get union members to contact politicians, have rallies. Unions can have political activist training, and there's even some more ambitious efforts to actually help union members or other interested workers run for political office. So there can also be very intentional efforts. And again, unions don't have to be the only institutions of collective voice doing this. Maybe they're just the most obvious. Okay, so then the typical methodology is at a micro level, collect a bunch of data, right? You can see whether they have access to non-union voice or whether they're a union member or not, things like that. Collect some measures or one measure, depending on your study. On the political side, did you vote is the most obvious measure, but there's lots of other things, right? And then, run a regression, and people with varying levels of union voice, right? Is there a positive relationship to likelihood of voting or contacting a politician or something like that? And again, the assumption here is that it's causal, but of course, just, correlation does not prove causality, right? So this raises some key methodological challenges, right? Perhaps the most important being, trying to really pin down causality. And so something that we do in the paper we find useful is to, make it clear that there could be a variety of sort of relationships here that would yield this type of empirical relationship, but doesn't necessarily imply a causal relationship. And we're not going to be able to distinguish all of these different possibilities, but we think it's important to be very clear about the different possibilities. And just quickly, another methodological challenge that runs throughout the literature is even if we can pin down a causal relationship, it's much more difficult to tease out, is it the skills channel, is it the attitudes channel, or is it specific skills, specific attitudes? And so that's something that the literature has wrestled with. And then there's also heterogeneous effects that the literature needs to pay attention to. And Ryan will pick up with a quick review of the evidence.
So yeah, thanks. I'll just go quickly through some of the studies in sort of three broad areas. The first is the idea of connecting individual voice to civic participation. And here we see sort of two large waves that occurred. The first happened in the 1980s and 1990s. And by and large, this consisted of a lot of small scale studies. Folks like Eldon in 1981, for instance, looked at one non-union factory in the US and tried to connect one sort of core area, largely job autonomy or work autonomy, to feelings of stronger political advocacy. Smith in 1985, similarly, sort of interviewed workers in 55 companies and found spillover from autonomy to political efficacy. Greenberg looked at 15 lumber mills and also found representative and direct voice had effects on political participation. So that was the first wave in this broad topic. The second wave, I should say, the one of the biggest sort of concerns here of the first wave was that we have representation issues, and these studies largely came out of the U.S. climate. So the second wave corrected for this, and the second wave looked more comparative, was quite European in focus, and had a much more sort of quantitative approach, broad quantitative approach to what it was doing. So larger in scale, using sort of classic regression approaches. So we have folks like Lopez looking at 15 European countries and looking at, again, autonomy and their effects on civic behavior. Timming and Summers looking at 27 European countries, and again, looking at autonomy and its effects on things like commitment to democracy. And then John and I looked at various political acts, not just autonomy, but a variety of different actions politically, and we find that strong evidence of worker voice related to these 8 political actions: voting, contacting politicians, boycotting, being a member of a political party, and the like. So all of this basically results in a sort of overall contribution, which suggests that there's strong evidence showing that direct participation in workplace decision making is positively related to spillover behaviors. And a meta-analysis in 2020 really highlighted that nicely, clearly showing these effects. So the big concern here is around these wave 2 studies is the idea of causality. And so, one of the big arguments is that a lot of these data weren't panel in nature, and we can't know, what causal direction is going. And so an individual admin looked at this and, found that maybe the evidence wasn't as strong as we would have thought if you account for causal mechanisms. So one of the big concerns there is how do you overcome that? And so John and I tried to use like instrumental variables to try and overcome some of the problems of causality. There are also problems around mechanisms as well here. So what exactly is the mechanism that's leading from individual voice to civic participation? And all studies seem to struggle with sort of directly picking this up. Okay, so then
Ryan, you have 4 minutes left.
Got it, no problem. So, just briefly, two more broad areas that we cover is rather than looking at individual direct voice, you can also look at the effect of union voice on a specific action like voter turnout. There's an argument that unions engage in what can be thought of as a vote premium, sort of like a wage premium, but for voting. Lots of studies have looked at this, and they find that union members are more likely to vote than are comparable non-members. This is sort of an interesting finding because it has a range of outcome possibilities depending on what you account for. So the range can go from anywhere between 4 to 18% as a union vote premium effect, but a lot of this is going to depend on whether you consider some of the sort of methodological challenges around the vote premium concept, which I'll talk about in just a second. In addition to the union vote premium, we also see that union members vote differently from non-members in terms of who they vote for. So union members vote typically for more left-wing social democratic parties and candidates. But we see that this is actually weakened a little bit. That was a really common finding in previous studies, but it's weakened a little bit in recent studies as well. So some of the methodological concerns that have led to our sort of challenges or weakening of these interpretations. The first is the idea of mechanisms. So basically, the union vote premium can be at least partly explained as mechanistically as an income effect. So if union members are higher income folks vote more. So it might not be a direct union effect. It might be actually ascribed more to income differences. Although we find that union vote premiums decline after accounting for income, they don't necessarily go away completely. So that was what Alex Bryson's work tended to show in the European context. Other concerns on this in this area are causal in nature, selection problems. So union members might select themselves into union membership based on their higher political engagement, awareness of politics, and they might then vote more. Folks like Haziabdik and Bacaro tried to deal with this problem and found anticipation effects also help explain the results. And then the last point here is that we get significantly critical examinations arguing that actually maybe some of these connections are a little bit weaker given the rise of extremism, political extremism, and union member likelihood to be voting for extremist parties. Lena Renwald's work picks up this thread in particular. So the very last thing that we just want to highlight here is, after you have these sort of individual effects on things like voter turnout and what have you, can you aggregate those up into wider political influence? And we argue that in the paper that yes, you can actually create sort of or reshape political thinking by doing things like creating a working class electorate, having strongly politically educated workers that then go out and vote in certain ways. That can sort of change the democratic character of a political institution. But a lot of this might depend on political systems at play, what the characteristics of those systems are. John and I looked in particular at how more representative political systems might shape attitudes toward unions. And we found that the political system matters a lot in the aggregate in shaping these aggregate results. By and large, we see more representative systems yield more union influence. And we also uncovered some evidence that even in authoritarian or autocratic environments, we can see that unions can play a role in building democracy. Union members can go out and engage in protest activities or other types of actions that can shape the democratic nature of these systems. A couple of methodological concerns. One big one is causality. Here again, we don't necessarily know what the causal direction is with the relationship between unions and aggregate democratic societies. And two others, there's a contingency effect. Not all unions are going to be sort of overtly positive or overtly democratic in nature. Some unions are anti-democratic, so we can't assume all unions are going to do this. And some of these studies are quite localized, so there's generalizability concerns around these issues. So just in conclusion, to very briefly wrap up, what we see by and large is that these studies suggest we shouldn't overlook the effects of individual and collective voice on civic engagement. Spillovers seem to matter from the workplace into the political arena, and unions can be quite intentional also in how they shape political climates. We see a lot of scholarship on this area, which allows us to have some high confidence in the sort of relationship between workplace effects and political and civic effects across a variety of countries. But we can't conclude with high confidence that this relationship is causal in nature. Rather, we have to account for things like causal possibilities and other endogeneity issues in this relationship. And so we have lower confidence that we're able to isolate specific mechanisms or channels. We can sort of identify the higher level mechanisms, but it's much harder to get to the lower level mechanisms and to have sort of direct evidence. So finally, just to conclude, we can argue that the accumulated research that we have here is better at identifying the ways in which we see worker voice shaping political engagement rather than identifying specific dominant transmission channels or certain mechanisms and ruling out others. So thanks very much. Appreciate it and happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you so much for this presentation. I think in times of increased populism in many countries, this is a very important chapter. So yes, are there any questions? John. John?
Yes, I'm here. It just took me a second to get my mic back.
Sorry.
I like the conclusion. It seemed very balanced. Any sense from having reviewed this literature and been actively involved in it, to what extent the unions actually attract people who want to view the unions as a way to be involved and probably would have been involved anyway?
Can I take that, John, or I'm happy to.
Yeah, and so I think to go back to your chapter and the previous one, perhaps, right? The institutional context in which people are, members or not, or covered or not, is very different. But the easiest comparison is North America versus continental Europe. And so I think those concerns are probably stronger in Europe, where maybe joining a union is more of a political act, less tied to your job, whereas in the U.S., of course, you're covered by being in your job rather than some other basis. But it's certainly something that the literature has paid a lot of attention to. Alex's work, we should have Alex here. Your paper features his work. Our paper features his work. And our read is that that's likely going on, but that it can't explain all of the effects, and so it might dampen some of the unadjusted magnitudes, but it can't explain everything that's going on.
Just a quick. Just one quick point there. Just also to refer to Hazy Abdik and Bakaro's recent study from 2020, which tries to get a little bit at that and finds like a sort of an anticipation effect going on by folks before they join unions. Tries to sort of empirically deal with that. So just to highlight that as a source there.
Just a slightly cheeky question, if I may. I mean, Klaus told us earlier that unions were in decline, and you're telling us that unions are probably affecting civic participation, but can you pick that up in, I mean, are there long-term trends in civic participation? Is there a time, I guess what I'm asking is there a time trend aspect to this, as well as a cross-section?
Ryan?
You know, I think that this is one of the sort of big debates that we've had actually, you know, sort of within institutions. You know, to what extent is, if I'm understanding the question correctly, you know, to what extent is any of this likely to sort of continue if union density continues to fall? Unions should, you know, maybe be less politically powerful, and therefore we might see lower degrees of union influence on political systems and structures.
But also civic participation, if it's related to civic participation, has that declined in many countries over the years? I'm sorry, I'm ignorant of that particular literature, but has it declined in the same way that union representation has declined?
So one big argument that we see from like the political science literature actually is that it might not be necessarily the participatory acts that have declined, but rather the connection between unions and voting blocks. So essentially voters, one of the arguments that's made quite frequently in recent political science is that voters are no longer see themselves as being so tethered to like union positions or union ideals. So the sort of labor vote might not necessarily be the like be a structurally obvious vote to target for political parties. And so what has happened is parties have had to diversify the types of voting blocks that they seek to sort of build a coalition around. And what that has potentially done is caused, you know, this sort of connection between like a social democratic party and a union member to be a little bit more frayed than it would have been in like the 1970s or 1960s or what have you. I don't know that the participation is falling, but I do wonder if the sort of working class voter identity might sort of be a little bit more challengeable in current times as relative to where it would have been maybe 30 or 40 years ago. I don't know, John, if you have any thoughts as well.
Okay, many thanks for the questions and answers. I fear we are running a little bit out of time. Therefore, I suggest we move on. We now have Jens with his chapter on works councils.
Yes, hello. We'll share my screen. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to present here today. My chapter in the handbook is about works councils, and two other participants today, Uwe and Klaus Schnabel, also have written chapters about works councils or review articles recently. So my review is a bit different, is that I look a bit more of an international perspective and looking at especially in European effects of works council in other European countries as well, and focusing in the second part also a little bit more on the why works council might increase productivity. However, before I start, I would like to, because we are maybe in an audience here where not always everyone is familiar with the term of a works council. So the first introduction which I want to give is what is a works council? And works councils are institutional bodies of representative communication between a single employer and employee for workplace. So it's really speaking about a workplace or an establishment and representative voice of employees at a single employer. However, I go one step further in this chapter in the definition of a works council and say works council need to have statutory rights for information consultation, and they can have statutory rights for co-determination. This turns out to be quite important if I review the empirical literature later on, because we have a lot of countries where there are statutory information and consultation rights, but they are not really called works councils. But in other countries, we have something which is called works council without these statutory rights. So I'm focusing here on statutory rights for information consultation. If I'm speaking about information rights, we usually mean rights to information disclosure, usually about financial and economic matters. Consultation means it's an exchange of views between and a dialogue between employer and the works council. It's mainly the employer has to consult the works council, but can make the decision in the end. However, we know all these theories about high performance work practices, this always going against the views of the workers or the works councils is probably not the way or path for high productivity. And this third part, co-determination, which is only a part of works council in a very limited number of countries, means that management and works council needs to get a mutual consent before certain policies, usually HR related policies, can be implemented within a firm. And we clearly see that these statutory rights give a lot of bargaining power towards employees, and especially if you have co-determination rights, we have much higher bargaining power on the side of employees. However, all these rights or legal texts about works councils come always with a quite nice statement in the beginning, which says that management and works council shall work in the spirit of cooperation and with due regard for the reciprocal rights and obligations. So the idea in the statutory textbooks, statutory books about works councils is that this is a cooperative employment relations between the employer and its employees. The second part, where we see huge differences between countries, is what kind of establishments are eligible for these works councils. So in every country where they have works councils, there are this kind of works councils, we have a threshold, which is typically between 5 and 50 employees. The other very interesting and important part here is that employees can establish a works councils. They don't have to. So this is, in this case, the opposite from management-led involvement and participation initiatives. In this case, that is not the management who generates or to establish the works council, it's the employees. And also employees can establish a works council, they don't have to. So we observe a quite huge variety, even within countries and eligible firm sizes, that we see establishments with and without works council. Of course, there are indeed selection issues. However, there is one thing what works councils can't do, and this is they can't usually bargain for wages, and they have not the right to strike. And these are two areas which are usually reserved to unions. Okay, that's basically what are works councils. So where do we find works councils? It's most countries with works councils following these definitions can be found in the European Union, because the European Union had a directive nearly 20 years ago, which was for information consultation of employees, which mandated all countries to introduce this kind of works council types or information consultation for employees at workplaces in their national labor laws. And here the information consultation rights are described here, but the EU directive defines minimal standards and also said the implementation should take into account the national industrial relations structure. So we see even in the European Union a wide variety on rights and implementations of these kind of works councils. There are a couple of countries, most notably Austria, Germany, and the Netherlands, which have a much longer tradition of this kind of works councils, and where we also see these so-called co-determination rights, where the mutual consent between works council and management is necessary for changes or implementation for certain HR policies, for example, working time monitoring and so on. Outside Europe, and this has already been mentioned in a previous talk, South Korea is an example where it's also information and consultation rights for where we observe them for works councils as well. So what I want to focus in this chapter is on empirical studies of the economic effects on productivity, profitability, and wages, and then particularly in how these effects eventuate. However, I have also to say that the vast majority of the empirical evidence comes from Germany, but I include all other countries as well. I would like to start with a short summary about the main economic effects, which is on productivity, wages, and profitability, and give you a little bit of an empirical pattern what we observe in the empirical studies before I come to some examples of how works councils might improve the productivity. Studies who empirical studies who analyze the productivity effect on works councils usually or predominantly find positive effects, but also we have some or few studies who find insignificant effects. And if I speak about these studies, we have studies who usually use the log value added. Value added is mostly sales minus intermediate inputs as the outcome variable or as the productivity variable or some sort of this variable. What you also observe in this empirical pattern is that if we're looking at different groups of firms, especially in terms of firm size, we see that the economic effect or the marginal effect is usually only half the size if you're looking in smaller firms compared to larger firms. And the most notable classes of employees or firm size which we see in the literature is 21 to 100 or 50 to 259 employees. Some of these studies then show that in the smaller firm size classes, the productivity effects also turn insignificant, but the effect size is more or less half of the total total firm size. However, the quite interesting thing is that this pattern that the effect size is half the size or 50% in small firms compared to all firms, something which you also find if you're looking at productivity effects on HR practices on productivity. And here I think especially on these studies in the spirit of the Bloom-Van Reenen data set, which has been spread around, I think, 20 countries nowadays, which have similar data sets to understand HR practices on productivity. We also find in productivity that the effect size depends on a wider industry relations, environment, or ownership status, for example. Another, what we also find, especially if you're looking more in international studies, is that we also find mostly insignificant and even a few negative effects of works council on productivity if these studies use more subjective productivity measures. I will come to this point if I speak about the profitability on the next slide, because this becomes then much more contradicting the differences between objective and more subjective measures.
Jens, you have 5 minutes left, and sometimes you're difficult to understand.
Okay, I try to speak more into the microphone. Thank you. The effects on wages are predominantly positive. If you're looking then into the profitability, what I already said is that these difference between subjective and objective measures becomes more or clearer or more opposing to each other. We find predominantly positive effects and also a few insignificant effects if you're looking at works councils on profitability. If you have something like a value added measure minus wage costs as the productivity measure, again, only half the size for smaller firms. But what we also see across data sets is that we usually find negative effects if you have any kind of subjective profitability measures. And it doesn't matter really what kind of subjective profitability measures these studies using. These effect sizes are quite comparable if you have similar samples. And this is a quite interesting and important point, especially if you're looking about the on the effect of works councils on productivity in many countries which rely on surveys which only have this kind of subjective profitability and profitability measures, which tend to find negative effects of these of works council, and which is an open question then why we find these huge difference between these measures. And one of the reasons could be the missing benchmarking in this subjective profitability measure. And then let's just quickly say where I put a lot of emphasis in this chapter is how might works councils influence productivity. First of all, I have to say here's also an area for future research. There is no real mediation study. There's no really a study shows works councils are introduced, and afterwards, for example, there's more training in these kind of firms, which we would ideally have to see really mechanisms. What we see here, all this list which I have here, is more that we have seen that works councils are also associated with these kind of HR or management practices. And so the question is, can we then, or this is a good argument is then, because works councils are trigger or more HR practice or management practices or make them more sustainable, that's why we observe a higher productivity effect of works councils, for example. However, the problems here is clearly that introduction of works councils in a rare event, and so we have very few variation over time within firms. And then not to be too much over time, I will quickly conclude. What I've shown here in this chapter is that the majority of studies show that works council can provide a route to higher productivity within firms, that they are associated with a huge number of HR practice or management practices which are performance enhancing. So we know that more training leads to higher productivities. Incentive pay can lead to higher productivity. So there's a good argument, even if these mediation studies are not available so far, and that many of these productivity effects are comparable to the effects of HR practices. The problem, what we also see, especially about profitability, but also in a lesser extent in productivity, that there is a huge difference between objective and subjective measures, which is especially critical if you're looking at a number of European countries where only the subjective performance and performance measures are available in surveys. And we have also to say that the empirical findings are largely skewed towards Germany so far. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for that great presentation, Jens. And I would suggest that we have some brief questions and answers. Are there any questions? If there are no questions, perhaps one brief question. I think, what do you think? What is also important? Heterogeneity of effects. So what are the circumstances that influence the economic performance of works councils? And what role does learning play?
So what was the second part?
Learning.
And?
Learning.
Yeah, the learning part. Yeah, that's something I had it on one slide, but I skipped it because of the time. Yeah, what we observe is that there is, especially initial years of works councils are, there's a higher likelihood of conflicts within firms. So that takes some time before positive effects arise. However, the learning is something which we know from Germany, where we have a tradition of works councils and this kind of worker participation. And I think it would be quite interesting to understand if this kind of learning effects, this kind of conflicts before we come to a positive or more positive outcomes and productivity, for example, would also can also be observed in countries which do not have this kind of cooperative employment relations, and that's open because we don't have any evidence on this. And the second thing, yes, there's a huge heterogeneity. That's one of the parts which I skipped for the sake of the 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much. Then I would suggest that we have the last presentation by Alexandra on board level worker representation. Alexandra.
Thank you, and I will now share my screen. Yes, okay, so thank you again, Uwe, for organizing this session, and I will be presenting a chapter that is actually, or which has the aim to review the literature on board level worker representation, and I'm currently revising the paper, so any comments you might have are most welcome. So what do we mean by board level worker representation? So the board level worker representation refers to the legally sanctioned worker rights to participate in the strategic decision making of the companies, regardless of their underlying equity investments. And actually in Europe, these kind of participatory rights are quite common, and there are actually 18 of the EU countries and Norway who have some form of participatory rights granted to the employees. And what I actually aimed to understand with my review is what are the characteristics of these companies that have such employee involvements in the decision making, and I call them the shared governed companies, of the companies with the shared governance compared to the conventional governance. And actually, just to introduce a bit the general conclusion, so there is first of all some skepticism about whether workers can affect firm decision making, because generally they don't have a majority of the board seats, and they also by law need to act in the interest of the companies as directors. Still, what is important is these worker representatives come to the board with different information, with different perspectives, and that should imply that their interests of the employees should be more likely, or it's more likely these interests are going to be incorporated in the firm's decisions. And overall, indeed, studies support or showed some positive effects for the employees of this participation, and this indeed comes at some cost for the shareholders, but it seems, at least this is the impression I get from the literature, that these costs are not really very high. So I start my review first by discussing the drivers. So why do some countries, why do some firms have board level employee representation, and why do others don't? Now, at the country level, of course, the main driver is the legislation. And as I mentioned earlier, many of the European countries have some kind of legal rules which provide workers with some kind of influence, the Germany being, of course, the one granting the largest amount of participatory rights, and most of the other countries provide for some minority representation of worker representatives on the board. Besides that, there's been some studies who actually try to pinpoint the institutional characteristics more broadly that have led either to emergence of the legislation or the installment of this board-level employee representation. And there seems to be specific, let's say, configurations of institutions in terms of the labor market institutions, ownership types, as well as the collective bargaining and the union union strength, which somewhat lead to the emergence of this kind of board representation in some of the countries, but have prevented this from happening in other countries. Now, at the state level, at the firm level, sorry, we have different studies who, for instance, again, related to the legislation, show that a key determinant, of course, of the employee representation is firm size, and this comes directly from the legislative rules, which often link the right of the workers to appoint representatives to certain number of employees. Then besides that, in some countries, these rights are granted to firms in state ownership. And then also, I have myself looked into some of these determinants from the perspective of a country such as Denmark, where employees have the right, but don't have the obligation to appoint their representatives. And in line with what was mentioned, actually, I think by Francis early on, we do find that it's not that all employees value this representation. So they don't necessarily opt to be represented, but we do find that this is more likely the case in companies with high relevance of firm-specific human capital, in companies with a stronger union strength, and it's less likely in companies with strong owners, family owners, and in generally more concentrated ownership. So we do see that not in all companies, specifically in Denmark, about 25% of the companies have employee representation, meaning that there are 75% in which employees have opted not to be represented on the board. Now, what does it mean for company behavior? So there are theoretically different views on whether board-level employee representation is positive or negative, and I'm pretty sure you are very much familiar, but in the chapter I try to summarize the positive aspects and the negative views. The positive primarily as related to the transaction cost theory, suggesting that employees, by having a voice in the corporate affairs, can ensure themselves a return on the firm's specific investments, and that should motivate them to be more productive and to develop more firm-specific human capital. Also, from the positive side, studies suggest that employees can act as monitors over firm management. They are also very important in providing firm-specific information to the board, and this should indeed improve the decision-making. And finally, as was also mentioned earlier, there is some, although indirect, link between being represented and, of course, the work climate, the satisfaction and productivity. And this is further due to the fact that it's been found that in certain firms, employee representation leads to more wage equality, and that also affects motivation and satisfaction of the employees. The key negative aspect or the key, let's say, concern about board-level employee representation comes from the property rights theory, suggesting that employee board representation is a limit for the shareholders in designing the optimal contract, and that employees, because of the fact that they have the fixed claims in the company, will aim to enforce or guide policies away from shareholder maximization towards more short-term policies, less risky policies, lower motivation, and so on. And some also suggest that the presence of employees, rather than providing information, might actually create delays in the decision making, and also that employees, rather than monitoring, might be actually building coalitions with managers against the shareholders. Now, what do we know about this, the pros and cons? Well, so far, I must say the literature is also inconclusive in the sense that we have some studies supporting the positive effects of employee board representation, some studies showing also or pointing to the negative effects. As all the other studies so far, these studies somewhat suffer from endogeneity issues. But I must say that recently there's been a very important improvement in addressing these issues. So here I have provided an overview of the different studies from Germany. And these studies look at different aspects and different outcomes, such as labor costs, investments, productivity, financial performance, as well as the mechanisms through which employees might affect firm behavior, namely information provision, access to financing, and CSR. And if I can summarize these studies, I could say that generally there is quite some alignment in providing evidence that employee directors provide important information to the board, that this information can be used or beneficial for the strategic decision making and also for adopting cooperative solutions in the time of crisis. There is also some evidence suggesting that employee representation leads to more job stability, especially in the crisis time, but also that employees somewhat pay for this stability through lower wages. And finally, there is, of course, also some evidence pointing to the fact that employee board representation improves corporate social responsibility and generally the policies, firm policies, environmental friendly policies. This evidence is primarily, or a large part of the evidence builds, of course, around the case of Germany, where employees have, in larger companies, have half or 50% of board seats, and they compare the firms with quasi-parity co-determination with the firms with 1/3 co-determination or worker board representation. Now, there is also evidence on other countries than Germany. As I said, I have worked on Scandinavia, but there are many other authors who have worked in Scandinavia, and here we primarily compare companies with minority employee representation and companies with no employee representation. And we do find, or the researchers find, that generally employee board representation again creates some positive benefits, creates some benefits for the employees, again in terms of the higher job security, but also somewhat better, higher satisfaction, which in turn also somewhat increases or reduces the turnover. Although again, the size of these effects is not very large. And also, generally, the studies are quite inconclusive, but I cannot see, I haven't found any robust evidence showing that this minority worker representation on board significantly negatively affects firm performance and firm value as such. There are only a couple of studies, specifically one for Norway and also a study for Denmark, that somewhat suggests that the shareholders might be mildly averse and suffering from this employee board representation. But overall, I would say quite a positive picture, and also in terms of the general impression about these worker directors in the country, at the country level.
Sorry, 4 minutes are left.
Yes, this employee representation, it's not something that significantly restrain firms in maximizing their value and their long-term prospects. Now, I conclude this literature review by looking at some studies who go a bit deeper, and I think this is also something where we should continue. Specifically, there are studies who really question the board members about what is the behavior of employees and the shareholders on the board and how this affects board processes and interactions between directors. And what we find based on these different studies is that generally, indeed, employee directors are positively perceived as board members that can contribute very important firm-specific information. They also are able to understand the necessity of, for instance, layoffs in the case of when the firm is facing crisis, and they don't seem to be objecting that. And generally, even if they tend to be more stakeholder-oriented, this stakeholder orientation does not prevent them from siding with the shareholders when this is to the benefit of the long-term firm performance. So all in all, I would say that this evidence from the boardroom itself shows that there is some nice collaboration going on between the employee directors and the shareholder directors, and this is more the case when employee directors are elected from among the workers of the company. Now, to sum up this evidence, so all in all, I would say that the research on employee board representation has been able to identify some of these things by using more and more, let's say, sophisticated techniques and better data to account for the endogeneity issues. And today we can say that overall there is some support of the positive effects of employee board representation for the employees, and it also seems research also seems to show that these positive effects do not come at a significant cost for the company shareholders. Now, as issues for further research, of course, I would like to point to some of the elements. I think more studies, more evidence is needed about the interaction between employee directors, the work councils, and unions. Some researchers somewhat are skeptical whether board representation is really capturing the effect of employee directors rather than the underlying additional institutions in the firm. I think more evidence is needed about interaction between employee directors and shareholder directors and the different contingencies that facilitate this interaction and exchange of information between these members. I also found that there is very limited evidence about the challenges of employee representation in multinational corporations. And also, I would say, I would invite researchers to look further to see, to look into different new outcomes, maybe more more proximate outcomes to employee, to workers board activities, and also maybe to adopt alternative theoretical lenses to analyze this institute of workers' voice. Okay, thank you.
Uwe, you are muted.
Yeah, Uwe, you are muted. Yeah, Uwe.
Uwe, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Okay, here I am. I think we have time for some questions and answers, and then Klaus Zimmermann will have some final words. So we have one hand raised. Would you like to ask your question?
Hi. This will not be a question, just a very sad reflection. My name is Jacek Klich, and I come from Poland. Working on worker councils for more than 20 years. And this sad reflection is that such impressive history with worker councils in my country. Worker councils were simply smashed out from the scene during this political and economic transformation. This changes in my country's annihilation of worker councils, okay? So this was my pleasure to listen to you and to this is a kind of, a very positive stimulus for me. So thank you all of the presenters. Thank you.
Thank you. Jens.
Alexandra, if I think about board level worker representation, and what comes to my mind is this political discussion about the inequality between worker pay and C-level pay. So do you have any evidence that this inequality or this the range between the normal workers and CEOs or C-level employee managers is lower or not affected by worker board level representation?
Yeah, so I have found one study. I don't think I have maybe I have put it. Yeah, I think it's a recent study which actually finds somewhat lower wage inequality. Yeah, so comparing generally the wage inequality at the firm level, they do confirm. I think it's the Finnish study when they actually have the employer-employee match data. I'm working now on a study where I also want to look at these kind of aspects, again using employer-employee match data. There's been some other studies which also actually two of them that look at the use of managerial variable pay. And for instance, Gordon and Schmidt show that in the companies with employee co-determination or board participation, the companies are less likely to use variable pay, which also implies that it means that the managers will be paid less and there will probably be a lower wage inequality in these firms. But then there is another study by Kraft who shows the opposite. So my question, my answer to you is, it is likely the case, but I cannot tell you that there is robust evidence supporting that the board level employee representation really leads to lower wage inequality so far. So I think if I can add, I mean, especially this Finnish study the Norwegian study, which looked into all these different elements. Their conclusion is that it's not the board level employee representation, but the union power behind the employee representation. And here I'm a bit unsure whether this is actually a problem, because that just means that the stronger influence of unions at the firm level will also affect these aspects, right? But I think it's very hard to disentangle these different institutions at the firm level. And that's also why I was suggesting as one of the future research topics, that we need to look into these interactions and try to disentangle what is really the driving force behind this, if this is what we want to learn, right?
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. And I think we now have some final words by Klaus Zimmermann.
Well, Uwe and all speakers, thank you very much for contributing to this event and to this session. I would like to first stress that this is part of a huge, longer and much larger project to collect evidence in all parts of issues related to human resources in general. It's so we attempt to create about 600 chapters over 30 sections, and this project is not just has not just the ambition to have one book at the end. Well, there will be one in the middle, so to speak, of course, but it's kind of a living project. So some of the papers presented here are already online, others are still in process of being developed, and that's similar to other parts of this project. And also we can gain and accumulate knowledge in the process of discussion. So it was very important to see how well developed this field is and how valuable the contributions are we have here. So hopefully that was one attempt to the interaction between the authors, but also the confrontation with outside knowledge, hopefully also coming through the presentation of the entire session, which will be put online in the near future. So all chapters can be, if authors want, be revised in the future. And this is part of the lovely idea Springer Nature has with this project. So I would again like to thank in particular Uwe, of course, bringing not only the project as such into good progress, but also bringing together all of you this afternoon, at least in afternoon in Istanbul, together to present here. And I was following your talks. I didn't intervene early, since I also had to be at another conference parallel, which was essential. This is how it happens nowadays. Yeah, it's the same time in various places. Forgive me, but I was listening to all of your talks, and I'm quite very impressed about the quality of the work, and I'm looking forward to see the whole product visible. And we will go, as many of you know, we will go on with the same idea to have parts of the handbook discussed or presented at various events throughout the year, but also within next year. So thank you very much. And also thank you, EBES, for allowing us to have this workshop, and also for recording it so that we can put it, make it available. And I will let you know how you get to it. Thank you very much, and have a good remaining day.
Yes, also thank you for presentation, for discussing, and specifically to the authors from the United States who woke up early. I appreciate that. And yes, have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Take care.